The Ruthless Sex Master. Chapter 1. She panted as she ran speedily across the street, the armed policemen chasing after her like a wanted criminal. She was breathing so heavily, her bag hung around her neck and dangling in the air. Unfortunately, she stumbled over a stone and fell on the floor, hurting her arm in the process. Ah! She winced as the pain niggled at her. Remembering the cops were after her, she jumped on her feet so she could resume running. But a bullet flew above her head and she froze. "Don't move!" a voice yelled. "Hands in the air! Now!" She folded her lips and lifted her hands above her head. She could feel them coming close from behind. "Interlock your fingers behind your head and get on your knees," another said. Their guns were all pointing at her. "I haven't done anything wrong," Octavia replied, her voice sounding a little hoarse. "Get on your knees, kid. Now!" another yelled and she did as they said, falling on her knees. "Just let me go," she growled. "I don't wanna hurt anyone." The policemen looked at each other and scoffed, probably finding it amusing how a teenager could threaten them. "Get her bag. Quick!" the chief snapped and one of the men rushed to her, aiming for her bag. Octavia's heart skipped as she was determined not to let go of the bag. Yes, she had stolen, but she wasn't ready to let go of the money. "I told you to let me go," she grumbled just when the policeman was about taking her bag. She snapped her neck and a strong invisible wind kicked him off his feet. He yelped as he flew in the air and landed far away, on the hard grassy floor. It was a rough fall and he passed out. The rest of the men looked at each other in shock, then back at Octavia. They cocked their guns and pointed it at her and immediately, the same thing happened to them. They were swept off their feet and made to fall hard on the floor. They were close to unconsciousness. Octavia cleaned the blood that rolled down her nostrils and jumping on her feet, she continued running away. She was more than happy she'd been able to secure the money. She needed it badly. Where she had to go was extremely important. She got to the train station and booked a ticket and she made sure she took the last seat. She always preferred being in the dark and alone quiet. Well, you could say she was quiet. But mess with her, and you'll quiet can also be crazy. In no time, the train was moving to her destination. The train came to a stop and just like everyone else, Octavia got off and proceeded to the road to get a cab. She had the cap of her sweater over her head and kept her gaze on the floor. 19-year-old Octavia was one weird lady. She was pretty, blue eyes, and mostly acted like a psycho. Octavia's life has been a rough one as she grew up in a polygamous family. Her mother died while she was 7, leaving her and her sister to their impossible father and stepmother. Her sister Micah had left home few years ago when she had an embittered problem with her father. She left the family, telling only Octavia where she was headed. But few days ago, Octavia realized her sister wasn't the only one that had to leave the family. She realized she could no longer be a part of them. Her hands were in her sweater pockets as she walked along and finally got to the roadside. It was almost evening. She boarded a cab and made sure the cap of her cardigan was properly over her head. "Wow, nice eyes you've got," the woman beside her in the cab had said. And Octavia cringed. She thought of saying thanks, but instead, she just covered her cap properly and looked out the window. She hated talking to strangers. The rest of the drive was silent with just the car's FM producing a little entertainment. Not like Octavia paid attention to it. Anyway, so many thoughts kept flying through her mind as she leaned her head on the hard window. She thought of her life, her sister, and the family she left behind, the pathetic family. All she wanted was to be away from them, far away, and hope she never gets found. She got to the area she wanted and in a low gruffy voice, asked the cabbie to stop. She got off, paid him from the cash she had, and continued walking to her destination. She knew there was nowhere she could ask the cabbie to take her there. She lowered her head as she walked. her bag around her neck and her hands lost in her trouser pockets. A stranger looking at her would find her suspicious. Pretty and suspicious. Her steps were fast and smart, and finally, she got to the restricted territory. Going through the thick bushes and not having any specific plan in mind of how she was going into the building. She could sight it. The tall, beautiful building above the forest-like place. And just when she was getting closer, they showed up. Stop right there. She heard a husky voice from behind and stopped moving immediately. From the footsteps, she could tell they were many. She heard the cock of a gun but still didn't move. She didn't have plans of attacking them because she felt they were people from the building and she was in their territory. Raise your hands above your head and turn around. Slowly, another instructed, and Octavia lifted her hands, but didn't turn around. Who are you? And what do you want? The first boy asked, and that was when she turned around. Slowly. My name is Octavia. And I'm looking for my sister, she replied, taking the number of men into her eyes. They were boys, not men. The first boy looked at the rest, then back at the others. Who's your sister? He asked. And she answered. Her name is Micah. Micah, one of the boys repeated. They were silent for a short time. Why are you looking for her? The first boy asked, and Octavia hesitated for a few seconds. I want to see her, she replied and took in a hard gulp. Her hands were still over her head. The boys looked at each other, and as if exchanging a signal, the first boy turned back to her and said, "Move." With the gun, he pointed the direction he wanted her to take, and she followed. She walked ahead of them, less scared of the fact they were the ones behind her, although she felt so uncomfortable. They walked out of the bushes and got to the big main gate and just one switch on it. The gate was open from inside. Octavia's eyes beamed as she stared at the incredible building in front of her. A wow almost escaped her mouth. It was capacious and contained different buildings in it. And there she was, thinking it was just one building. She saw lots of cars, boys and girls moving around. Some were smoking. Somehow, Octavia felt safe among them because she knew they were just like her, supernatural. She continued feeding her eyes around and had almost forgotten the armed boys behind her. They took her to one of the buildings, and walking past a hallway, they came across a little crowd, cheering noisily. They were round in circle, and Octavia looked properly and discovered two people on the floor. In the middle, it was more like they were wrestling. Come on, BTCH. Get it done, someone yelled from the group, coupled with so many voices coming from the little gathering. Since they circled them, Octavia couldn't watch the fight properly, but she could tell when one of them actually won, and few people from the gathering cheered noisily. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Octavia tried to look through the crowd to see the fighters. The loser was still lying on the floor, while the winner was on her knees. But Octavia couldn't see her face cause she was backing her direction. But when she laughed and stood up, Octavia realized it was her sister. Micah, she almost called out, but restricted herself. Micah, who had just won the petty fight, stood on her feet and turned around to receive the cheers she was getting from her friends. But when she turned around, her eyes ran into someone she hadn't seen in years, her very own sister. Octavia. Her brows arched as she called the name in surprise. The crowd paved way and turned to also have a look, and were surprised to find a stranger in their midst. Octavia. Micah called again and rushed to meet her. The two sisters had mixed feelings running through their minds. Micah, Octavia called, her voice a little ecstatic. She's your sister. One of the boys that had led Octavia into the building asked, and Micah replied with a yes. Hey, what are you doing here? Micah called as she held Octavia's hand. They had a striking resemblance. Just that. Octavia was more pretty, and her blue eyes, they were heavenly. Octavia looked at her sister, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years, and confirmed a lot had changed in her. She was looking more rough, Her hair was kept in a porn style and she had so many piercings on her ears. I came to see you, she replied timidly. You brought out a stranger into the building? A lady suddenly asked from the crowd, referring to the boys who had accompanied Octavia in. She said she was looking for her sister. Okay. The one with a gun replied. It doesn't matter. What if she turned out to be a spy? Master Khalid would definitely punish you when he hears of it. What does she want? Anyway, another asked and Micah looked at her sister. She was still holding her hands, facing her. I want to stay here. Micah, I want to belong here. Octavia tried to speak lowly, but she was still heard. What? Are you crazy? Someone snapped. You can't stay here. The master said he doesn't want a new member added to the group, someone else said. But Octavia didn't say a word as she just lowered her gaze to the floor. She'd have felt so intimidated. But holding hands with her sister gave her so much relief. Micah studied her sister's face and knew something was wrong. Then, she turned to the rest of the people and said, Don't worry. I'll have a word with her. She should leave right away. Micah, if Master Khalid returns and finds her here, he might kill her for trespassing, a boy said as Micah turned back to her sister. Let's go, she muttered to her, and holding her hand, they left the scene together, going into a separate room. Thanks for listening to the Bravonovel audiobook. Welcome to download the Bravonovel app. Read the novel The Ruthless Sex Master online and get the latest updates.